So a little while ago, I was out with my 7-year-old daughter Evelyn for lunch, and while we were there, the waitress brought us one of these sort of menu things with like games and activities on it. And the highlight from this was a set of activities where it had like two pictures, and you had to spot as many differences as you could between those two. Evelyn loved it. And what that reminded me of was, these sort of brain teaser pictures that we have where you see the picture and what you're supposed to figure out is what's wrong with the picture. So I thought, to get started, we'll actually play this game and I'll show you some pictures. So let's start with an easy one. What's wrong with this picture? Yep, that's right. A fish belongs in water, not in trees. On to the next picture. What's wrong with this scene? If you're wrestling, can I suggest you look at the smoke? Yeah, hopefully you got that one. On to the next picture. What seems out of place or inconsistent here? Yeah, it's a bit tougher. If you didn't get it, maybe ask a friend, check with someone later. And let's land on this final one. What's wrong with this picture of the astronaut on the moon? Yeah, if you have difficulty, maybe look, where is the astronaut? What's in the background? Yeah, as humans, we've got this natural thing in our brains that helps us detect patterns. And, we're able to, even though it sometimes takes a minute, to spot when something's off. And, there's a sense of, for me, satisfaction, but almost like alarms, like a red flashing light and a klaxon going off and sort of saying, hey, that ain't right, that ain't right. And so if you've got a cognitive part, something in your brain that says something's wrong, I think we've also got something, in our hearts or in our guts, an instinctive sense when morally there's something wrong. Like when we see pictures in the world, there's a justice-oriented part of us that sets off that same alarm, that same flashing red light, to use the words of Chris Rock in Head of State, saying that ain't right. When we see pictures of war and conflict, whether that's a conflict in Israel and Palestine or the Ukraine or places we don't often hear from like Yemen or the Sudan or Myanmar, when we see these pictures, there's a response. That ain't right. When we see what it means to be a refugee, when we hear about the lives of the over 6 million people living in refugee camps around the world in dire conditions, our response is, that ain't right. When we see the devastation that natural disasters bring, wrecking homes, whether that's rubble from an earthquake, homes burned by wildfires, or swept away by flooding, there's something within us that says that's not right. That ain't right. And when we see the increasing conflict and polarization in our society, in our politics, the anger and the hate that shows up now all the time on social media, you read in the comments, we know that ain't right. Or when we see the impact of the increasing financial strains on our society, income inequality, rising housing costs, food costs, that leads to homelessness and, the over 400% increase in visits to food banks over the last 5 years in the GTA. We know that isn't right. Regardless of where you come from, ethnic background, religious background, age, how successful you think you are, whether you've been following Jesus for decades or this is your first time in church. There's something in us when we see these pictures of the world where we go, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And there's a sense that wells up within us of, a desire for justice when we see and respond with, compassion, grief, or even anger, or a desire for mercy, for care and compassion for those who are affected. Now, as we go through these pictures, maybe it's just me, but if I admit, I feel conflicted sometimes in how to respond. On the one hand, there's just a natural call to action of going, man, I see something wrong and I want to help. But as you get into it, as you start to try to get involved, you start to see just the full complexity, the scope, the size of these issues. It can make you feel small and feel like, how can I even make an impact? How can I make a difference? And so I find sometimes that there's a response of almost wanting to like give up or walk away, going, it's too difficult to face these realities. And it's just easier to get my head down, to focus on what I'm doing. Because, seeing how wrong things are can sometimes lead to a sense of despair. We're in the middle of a series, the series entitled The Longest Christmas Ever, Having Hope While You're Having to Wait. And it's examining exactly the question that we've been discussing. How are we supposed to live our lives in the middle of a world that's not yet what it feels like it should be? Said another way, what does it look like for us to wait with hope while we're waiting for justice and mercy? And through this series, what we're actually doing is walking through a section of the Hebrew Bible, which is the first 2/3 of our Bible, which was written in Hebrew, called the prophets. And in that section, you have prophets who are a group of people who, were listening to God and communicating his message to the people of Israel. Stuff like warnings, encouragements, guidance, just revelation of God's will and his plans for the future. Their messages were often beautiful, rich word pictures, powerful and transformative enough to be written down, to be recited, and actually memorized by God's people over centuries as words of hope and as images that had wisdom as they navigated difficult times and places throughout history. Can I suggest that their words can actually help us and guide us in terms of how we live with a desire to make things right in a time when things aren't? And though they were written hundreds of years before Jesus came, they actually point to him, to his coming as the fulfillment of God's promises for justice and mercy in this world. Today, the particular passage we're going to be reading is from the prophet Micah, and he was writing about 700 years before Jesus was born, and was writing into a period in Israel's history when the nation was divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And while the early part of his prophetic, career, if you will, it looked like everything was going well. But what was going on under the surface was actually that a bunch of the elites were leveraging, their power, their wealth, and their prestige to take advantage of those on the margins. As that was unfolding, Assyria, one of the major empires in the area, actually emerged as a world power and ended up conquering the northern kingdom and began to raid into the southern kingdom. So Micah was speaking at a time when a lot of God's people were experiencing injustice, insecurity at both the individual, family, and nation level, where the political order was destabilized and where war and the threat of war was very real. Is it any wonder, then, that the Israelites were yearning for peace and for justice to finally come and for mercy to reign? What were God's words of hope? What was the picture that he shared through Micah to his people? Here's what it says in Micah 4. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth. It'll be raised above the other hills, and people from all over the world will stream there to worship. People come from many nations and will say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain, to the house of Jacob's God. There he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between peoples and will settle disputes between strong nations far away. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore. Everyone will live in peace and prosperity, enjoying their own grapevines and fig trees, for there will be nothing to fear. The Lord of heaven's armies has made this promise. Though the nations around us follow their idols, we will follow the Lord our God forever and ever." What a beautiful picture, and what a hopeful picture. And what struck me about this picture in Micah 4 is that often we need a picture of the future. We need a picture that's actually full of promise and hope for the future, what the future has in stores. So hope while we're waiting is holding on to a picture of what we're waiting for. It can be easy to see the pictures of the world around us, to see the war, the injustice, and the greed. But maybe what we actually need to do is hold on more clearly to the pictures of what will be, of what we're waiting for. And I think in this passage, there's actually a few different images that are powerful. The first is a picture of a mountain. When the passage talks about the image of the mountain of the Lord's house being highest of all, it's talking about God being restored as ruler over all earth. This isn't about Jerusalem literally being higher than K2 or Everest that would make, pilgrimages there that the passage talks about really tough. The picture is the picture of the temple, which symbolized, God's presence here on earth being the most important place of all. And that as God ruled, that he does so not with the sort of power over or power for his sake, but with a posture of service and other-centered love, just as Vijay talked about this last week. So it's a picture of the mountain. It's also a picture of peace. Peace, not only where there's no more war, but peace where there's no more threat of war. In verse 3, it says this: "They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore." You're not turning your swords into plows or, plow instruments if there's a risk that war's coming back, because you're going to want that sword. It's not just a picture of there not being, no more training. It's actually a picture of there not being a need for armies anymore because there's no longer a risk of war. It's a reversal. It's a reversal of how things were at the time Micah was prophesying. Because, when, the call to war would come, messengers would be sent out and they'd invite everybody to come. And what would often happen is people would show up because they didn't have swords. They'd show up with their agricultural implements. They'd show up with, pruning hooks and these sorts of things and use them as weapons of war. And this passage is flipping that on its head. It's talking about the tools of destruction being turned into tools of provision, tools that give food and life and well-being. This prophetic passage is also a picture of unity. In verse 1 and 2, it says, "People from all over the world will stream there to worship. People from many nations will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God.'" Right? It's talking about people from everywhere, all kinds of different backgrounds streaming together with a common purpose to go to Jerusalem, to worship God and to follow his ways. And this is a pretty strong reversal because when it came to war, in those times, war wasn't just political, but it was also religious because every nation had their own god or gods. And so there was almost, spiritual conflict when it came to those wars. But in these passages, we hear people, rich, poor, old and young, from around the world coming together around stuff they have in common rather than arguing and fighting about difference. This passage is also a picture of God as the just judge. It says in verse 3, "The Lord will mediate between peoples and will settle disputes between strong nations far away." Throughout the Hebrew Bible, one of the defining characteristics when you'd ask, who is God, is that he was just and that he brought justice, resolving conflicts and settling disputes. And this isn't just, a picture of a strict disciplinarian, of somebody coming down harsh and, punishing those who've done wrong. But it's actually an image of a compassionate judge, of one who's merciful to those who are hurting, who've seen the wrong done to them, and who's helping those who are suffering the consequences of this broken world. This passage is also a picture of people doing what is right and following God. In verse 2, the nations say of God, "There he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem." I think a lot of our challenges as human beings is, regardless of our desires, we have a collective inability to trust God and follow his ways. And so this message of hope points to a future where we have the ability to fully trust Jesus, not only believing with our heads, but actually living out what we were always intending to, and as Jesus taught. Lastly, this passage is a picture of personal well-being, of peace and prosperity. Reading through the passage, it's easy to get caught up in, the global, the sort of large-scale elements of the passage, peace for all, God's rule in all of earth. But actually, my favorite verses was in verse 4, where Micah says this: everyone will live in peace and prosperity, enjoying their own grapevines and fig trees, for there will be nothing to fear. The word here, translated peace, has far-reaching implications. This is not only as an absence of conflict, but it's actually a pervasive, holistic sense of well-being. And caught in this picture is actually everyone owning their own land. After all, where would those grapevines and fig trees be planted? This is a reversal of one of those pervasive wrongs in Micah's time, where the wealthy were buying the land God had promised to the poor, taking advantage of them when something went wrong, like a bad crop or an illness. And then the people would end up in precarious situations that end up as day laborers or migrant workers, doing whatever they could to make ends meet, often working for the very people who'd taken advantage of them. But here, the economic and social injustices have been made right. Everyone will live in prosperity. Now, not prosperity in the sense of, everybody's going to be driving their own Lamborghini, but in the sense of everyone having enough economic security not to need to worry about whether they'll be able to keep their house or provide food for their family. Now, I'm not a farmer. In fact, if you talk to anyone, my thumb's officially brown. I can kill any plant you give to me. But as I understand it, if you were living hand to mouth in Israel, in the Middle East, the last thing you'd be planting is grapevines and fig trees. You plant wheat, barley, or whatever crop's going to yield you a maximum result for that year because you don't know what the future will bring. Grapevines and fig trees take years to produce fruit, to return their investment, right? So they're not the sort of thing you'd be planting if you weren't sure about your future, if you were afraid, if you were worried about being taxed beyond what you could afford, if you were worrying about them being burned down in a raid, or generally afraid for the future. So this is a picture of a time where we no longer need to be afraid, fearful of the future. It's a picture of things being finally and fully made right. Before we continue on, I'd just like to take a moment for us to think and pause on this picture, because there's lots in it. Images of the mountain, of peace, of unity, of God as a just judge, of us following God, and of personal well-being. So I'd like you to take 2 or 3 minutes and turn to one of the 2 people next to you and discuss the images. And here's just a few questions to get you started as you talk. Which one of these images stood out to you? Which one feels like good news for the world right now? Which one feels like good news you need to be reminded of? Hope you had a good discussion and some good stuff showed up. Reading through this passage, it's easy to look at the picture and go, yeah, it's beautiful. It's easy to look at it and even go, yeah, I want it. I want this to come true. I want this to be so. But the tough part of the picture is that it doesn't look much like our world. And the truth is, it actually didn't look much like the world of Micah when he spoke this, or those who heard what he was sharing, right? The message didn't actually lead to the world getting better for those that heard this message. In fact, it got much worse, right? The raiding from Assyria got worse. Actually, Babylon, another empire further to the east, rose up and ended up conquering the southern kingdom, destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, the place of God's power, and took the priests and the rulers back to Babylon as hostages. Well, it was bad. What was God's people's response? You can read it in the text. Their response was to trust God and to wait on him. It says this in verses 4 and 5. The Lord of heaven's armies has made this promise. Though the nations around us follow their idols, right? The very nations that end up conquering them, we will follow the Lord our God forever and ever. In spite of whatever had happened or will happen, there's a conviction here that God, the Lord of heaven's armies, the one who's in control, made this promise, and that he's going to come through. And the hope they have comes in trusting God and in following him. And so they're going to wait for God to come through. And I'd say it this way. They're actually waiting for Jesus to make things right. They were waiting for Jesus to bring God's justice and mercy. They ended up waiting over 700 years, the longest Advent ever. But they were waiting with hope, hope for a promise that Jesus would finally make things right. Now, as someone who didn't grow up in church, one of the more audacious or surprising claims that the Bible made was that when Jesus came that first Christmas, he actually came to fulfill all of this and to make things right. And you see that woven into the stories of Jesus' life, glimpses of how this prophecy in Micah 4 coming to fruition, often in unexpected ways. And this Advent season, what I wanted to do was actually zoom in to Jesus' birth and into the nativity scene. You see, his birth wasn't what you'd expect when you read the Micah passage. He wasn't born on the mountaintop in Jerusalem to fanfare, to royal coronation, in the temple or the court. He was born in a cave, probably on the outskirts of town with animals around him. But if you look closer, if you lean in, you see the world beginning to be reoriented around Jesus, towards him, just like the world got reoriented around God in our passage. You have the Magi, or wise men, probably a part of the elite from whatever countries they were coming from, traveling from the east, coming to worship Jesus. And while we don't know where they were coming from, it's interesting to think, as you look to the east, maybe they were coming from Babylon, one of the historic, empires of this time period in this place, or Persia, another big country. And what were they coming to do? They were coming to worship Jesus. Just like in Micah 4, you've got non-Jews, representatives of strong nations, great nations, acknowledging Jesus as a source of wisdom, seeking to follow him and to follow his ways. Who else is in the manger scene? You've got Joseph and Mary. They were in Joseph's hometown. But, the fact that they ended up in what was probably a cave means that Joseph's relatives, who normally would have let them stay at their houses, said no, rejected them. Probably due to Mary having been pregnant before she was married. How does God see Joseph and Mary in this? As the just judge? He responds with blessing, right? He blesses them with his son. He says they've found favor with him, and he pours forth his love on them. And last but not least, as you look at the scene, you see the shepherds, outcasts, the disreputable sort, the last sort of people you'd expect to see at any gathering of significance. But God shows his mercy inviting them and all those from the margins into the very center of his plan of restoration. This nativity scene is a picture. It's a picture of unity. It's a picture of people coming together from diverse ethnic origins, diverse social status, diverse backgrounds, all of them worshiping and following God's ways. Now, as we look at the nativity scene, it's pretty clear that that doesn't, complete the Micah 4 passage. The world still isn't perfect. But Jesus' coming announced the beginning of its completion. Right? What was it that the angels said to the shepherds to invite them to the manger? They said, I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. And as we were reading this a couple weeks ago in the Bible, in our Bible readings, there was a Bible Project video that was talking about what joy is. And it said this: joy is an attitude God's people adopt, not because of happy circumstances, but because of their hope in God's love and promises. So what does it mean to have hope and joy while we wait for Jesus to bring to fruition his justice, mercy, and peace? Or said another way, what's our role as Jesus followers in bringing justice, mercy, and peace? And two pictures come to my mind as I think about our role. One, the ambassador, and second, the embassy. The ambassador. I've always found it compelling, the idea of an ambassador to be compelling. Maybe, because when I was younger, this was one of the career paths I was interested in. I was thinking of, becoming a diplomat or going into the foreign service. And as I was studying or learning, an ambassador, what is an ambassador? An ambassador is a representative sent by a country, organization, or authority figure, which, in Jesus' day, that would have been a king or other ruler. And the ambassador gets sent to another country as sort of a physical representation of that king, somewhere where they can't be, to communicate or negotiate on the king's behalf. And in the Apostle Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, he actually uses exactly this language. He calls us ambassadors on behalf of Christ. We're called to represent Jesus here on earth, to communicate his message of reconciliation to the world. So when it comes to Jesus' work of justice, mercy, and peace, we are actually his authorized representatives in this world. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that there's at least 3 elements of what it actually means to be an ambassador in this world that can help us understand what it means to be Christ's ambassadors of justice and mercy. First, we have authority and power to act in his name. Ambassadors, as representatives of a king or a nation, they've got power, they've got authority, right? They can negotiate, they can enter into agreements, sign treaties, grant visas, citizenships, and more. They've got power, but the power actually isn't their own, right? Their authority is power that gets delegated to them on behalf of the one who has ultimate authority. So when it comes to engaging in justice and mercy, we're doing so not actually on our own strength or in our own power, but through the power that Jesus has given us. And it says this, Jesus said to his followers in John 20 after his resurrection, he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Right? That's delegated authority. We're being empowered to act in the same way that Jesus was empowered to act on behalf of God the Father. Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Power. Jesus sent the Spirit to dwell in us and empower us to do what he asked of us. In fact, just a couple of chapters earlier, Jesus promised that his followers would do even greater things as a result of that. So we've got authorization and empowerment to act as Christ's representative of justice and mercy. Second, we pursue God's agenda and not our own. Right? One of the things that's tough about being an ambassador in this world, or in the real world, is that you don't get to do whatever you want to do, whatever you think is in the best interests of Canada or whatever country you're representing. You generally have, a clear set of priorities, a clear agenda that's been given to you by the Prime Minister or whoever. And so your role is to pursue the priorities that they have given you, not how you feel or what you think matters. Thankfully, as Jesus' ambassadors, his plans that he's inviting us to follow are actually way better than anything that we can come up with. And one of the beautiful things about Scripture is actually that it paints a picture of God's agenda, right? The passage in Micah 4 that we're reading today can act as a guide, as a reminder of God's heart, and actually can motivate us to pursue his agenda. This passage and its twin in Isaiah 2, because the similar passage gets repeated twice, has actually been a motivator for Jesus' followers to pursue peace and justice throughout history. It's actually one of the favorite verses or quotes for a guy by the name of Ralph Bunche, who is the first Black Nobel Peace Prize winner. He won the Nobel Peace Prize because he was involved in negotiating peace in the Middle East. He helped write the UN Charter. He was hugely involved in the early civil rights movement, right? And what was driving him? This passage. In fact, if you visit his park, which is just outside the UN building in New York City, the verses about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks is right there on the wall. So the third element of being an ambassador is that we have limits to our role. While ambassadors have authority and power, it's true, there's also limits. I don't know if you saw in the news a couple of weeks ago, Justin Trudeau went down to visit Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago and to have a conversation. And this wasn't something that he said, I'll just send my ambassador to go and do that. It's something that was so important, he himself decided to take it on. Likewise, our role as Jesus' ambassadors isn't to bring completion to completion, that restored creation that we're talking about. That's ultimately his responsibility. What's our role? Our role is to respond when the opportunity presents itself and take that next step in embodying justice and mercy. Our role is to be Christ's ambassador. So I mentioned there are these two images, the image of the ambassador and the image of the embassy. After I graduated university, nearly 25 years ago, because I'm getting old, I spent the summer working in Ghana, West Africa, supporting a student organization. I arrived beginning of May and started to get settled in. I landed, I started connecting in the local universities, got involved in the culture and the community. And after a couple of months, I got an invite from the Canadian embassy there to come to their Canada Day party, which, as you can see on the screen, my slimmer and less bald self attended with my friend Christina. When I went to the party, what hit me was just how weird it felt when I crossed the gate from the hectic and loud streets into the quieter embassy. It felt like a totally different place. It felt a little bit like I was back in Canada. I was surrounded by all kinds of Canadiana artwork and signs and symbols. I was chatting with embassy staff and other Canadians from the area. They even managed to bring in some Timbits for the party. It was like being back in Canada. And that's technically what an embassy is. When you step inside an embassy, you're once again on Canadian soil. Can I suggest that the church is meant to be an embassy? It's meant to be an outpost of Jesus' kingdom, the kingdom of justice, mercy, and peace in the middle of a world that still ain't right. And if you're someone who's suffering, who's going through a rough time, where you feel like there's been a lack of justice, or mercy or peace for you, I wanted to say that I hope that the Well can provide you a place of refuge, a place where you can encounter Jesus and experience his healing. I think that the Prison Fellowship's Angel Tree Ministry that our Bolton and King congregations are involved with is actually a beautiful picture of what it means to both be an ambassador and to be an embassy. Through Prison Fellowship, members of our church, like me, my wife Lori, probably some of you, get the chance this year to participate in buying presents on behalf of a parent who's in the prison system and deliver it to their child. On the one hand, as I start thinking about the prison system, there's a lot that you could get caught up in, right? The complexities of the justice system, is it really just, what about, the stuff that led it up in that person's life to them ending up in jail? Because we know many of the people in jail, there's struggles with mental health issues, there's histories where parents were in the justice system themselves, where people were victims of abuse themselves. But we also know, they harmed someone, and that's a part of what landed them in jail. That's all, really complicated. And figuring out, Jesus' justice in that space feels way beyond me, although I am thankful for Prison Fellowship's work on restorative justice. But the opportunity in front of our church and in front of me isn't that, right? The invitation was whether I and whether we as a church could be ambassadors of his mercy in some small way by delivering these presents to kids who are struggling without at least one of their parents. And in doing so, can we bring joy, a spark of joy and hope that is at the heart of this Advent season? Could we be a place where the principles of Jesus' kingdom, principles of justice, of mercy, of peace, of love, and of joy shine through these sorts of activities like an outpost in a complicated world? Could we be his ambassadors and his embassy? So, as we end today, I want to leave you with just two invitations grounded in the images of the ambassador and the embassy. Two ways that we can respond with hope in Jesus' justice, mercy, and peace as we wait. First, I'd invite you to do a small act of mercy this Christmas. In part because this Christmas season gives us so many opportunities to engage with those in need, right? This Christmas, can you have eyes to see those around you who may be suffering or in need and respond? Right? It may be a little too late to participate in the Angel Tree Initiative, but there's lots of similar places where you can give gifts that bring mercy and joy to someone this Christmas. Or it can be as simple as picking up a few grocery gift cards or Timmy's gift cards so that when you see somebody who's homeless or who's begging, that you can give to them, right? It can be even just as small as a card of acknowledgement and of valuing somebody who may feel small or unseen in this time. So that's one invitation. The second invitation is to seek justice, mercy, and peace here at the church. If you're someone who's in need this Christmas, or if you know someone who's in need, can I suggest you contact or getting connected to our site pastors? If you're someone where, when I was talking about struggling with providing shelter and food, that's not theoretical to you, but it's actually real, can we be a place of mercy to you? As a church, we actually have a compassion fund, right? A fund which our congregation gives generously to, which we use to care for those in need, to address temporary physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. And so every Christmas, we push as hard as we can to be as generous as we can, giving gift cards and other ways of caring for those who may have need. Our desire is to be a place of refuge, a place of justice, and a place of mercy. So if you or someone you know is in need, please reach out. As we end our service, our worship team is going to lead us in singing the Christmas carol, O Holy Night. It's a song of hope, a song that reminds us of who Jesus is, and a song that reminds us that Jesus is at work, and in his name, all oppression shall cease.